one's character becomes evident at the end of one's life, when other people look back on it and summarize the achievements. And Garin died in the role that he loved as parish priest of Nelson, and his death was acknowledged nationwide. At his 60th birthday party, Garin pointed out to the assembled crowd that, by a singular and curious coincidence, he was born in 1810, had been in Nelson for 20 years, in New Zealand for 30 years, had left France in 1840, come to Nelson in 1850, and was now at the age of 60, this in the year 1870. He asked where he would be in 1880. It was a rhetorical question. Some years earlier he told his brother Numa that he was determined not to return to France to seek the comforts of home, preferring to die in combat, die with his boots on. By the end of his life, Garin and John Lampila were the only priests remaining of the original Marist missionaries who had ventured to New Zealand in the late 1830s and the early 1840s. Garin had had the opportunity to return to France, but had turned it down, saying it was something for the younger confreres. However, the rigours of Garin's immensely full life had begun to tell on him some years before, following the serious illness that he contracted when returning from his 1863 visit to Motueka. In the latter part of his life, his health was not good. He left more and more of the travelling work to his curates, and he suffered frequently from bronchitis. On 13th of April 1889 he was very unwell, and Brother Claude Marie sat up with him through the night. On 14th of April, in the company of the mission sisters and Father Marnie, his curate for the previous 14 years, he died aged 78. There he is, lying in state in the church. This is the second church in Nelson. He, having built the first church, and also the second, he lies there before the pulpit, which he occupied so frequently. According to the columnist describing his funeral, in the foremost carriages were the mayor and members of the city council, His Lordship Dr. Souter, Bishop of Nelson, Anglican Bishop of Nelson, and clergy of the Anglican Church, the Reverend P. Calder of the Presbyterian Church, and many prominent citizens. The procession passed through Collingwood Street, and thence along Hardy Street to Trafalgar Street, and by way of Bridge Street to Collingwood Street, and then via the wood to the new cemetery. All the business houses en route were closed, and the streets were lined with thousands of people. On arrival at the cemetery, the Archbishop and clergy chanted the service, and the coffin was borne to the grave by His Worship the Mayor, Mr. J. Sharp, Mr. C. Y. Fell, His Honour Judge Broad, Mr. M. Hunt, Dr. Duff, and Mr. Holt acting as pallbearers. Then there's a curious incident after his death, because they decided to build a memorial chapel to house his remains. This decision didn't happen immediately. So here's from a document in Marist Archives, Wellington. The Venerable Antoine Garin SM, Archpriest of Nelson, died at Nelson on the 14th day of April 1889. His body was placed in a shelf of wood, and this was put into a leaden coffin, the whole being enclosed in an outer coffin of kauri pine, and was buried in the Nelson General Cemetery on the 16th of April on an ordinary grave. And there's the grave there, in fact reused by his companion of many years, Brother Claude Marie, who's buried under the title Brother Mary. Subscriptions having been received from many persons, both Catholics and Protestants, The work was proceeded with, and the elegant chapel, which now stands in that part of the cemetery set apart for the Catholics, was, thanks to the untiring exertions of Father Marnie and the generous response to his appeal, completed early in the month of October. So a memorial chapel was built to house the remains of Garin in the crypt underneath. Steps were at once taken to obtain the sanction of the government authorities for the exhumation of the remains of the venerable archpriest, with the view of their being placed in the crypt of the chapel, and this having been given, the work of disinterment was begun on the 6th day of November 1890. So, given that he died 14 April 1889 and was exhumed 6 November, it's some 571 days after the death that his body is taken out of the ground. Now, do allow for the lead casket, but it would be reasonable to expect the body to have deteriorated significantly. The ground in which the coffin had been buried is a heavy clay, and it was found that owing to an unusually wet season, the water had percolated through the clay, and the coffin was lying in water, which had thoroughly saturated the outer wooden case. The coffin, when buried, was very heavy, but it was far heavier now. The increased weight was so great that the saturation of the outer coffin by no means accounted for it. With considerable difficulty the coffin was brought to the surface. The cloth with which it had been covered was naturally rotten, but the wood appeared perfectly sound. It had been intended to take off the outer shell and re-enclose the leaden coffin in a new case of polished heart of totara wood, and this was to be placed upon a concrete stand in the crypt. But doubts arose as to whether this water had not penetrated the inner coffins, in which case it was generally believed that decomposition would have so far advanced that it would not be advisable to leave the remains with only the outer protection of a wooden coffin. The outer shell was removed, but there was still some indecision as to opening the inner coffins. It was found that owing to the great pressure of the earth upon the lid of the outer coffin, the leaden one had given way, and it was conjectured that the water had penetrated, and in all probability there was still a quantity in the inner shell which would account for the extraordinary weight. Initially it was decided to bore an auger hole through the coffins at the foot. This was done with some reluctance by Mr. Miller, and a strong stream of water immediately poured out. It was fully half an hour before the outflow ceased, so that the inner coffin must have been quite full. The lead was very thick and took some time to cut through. Then the inner wooden coffin was sawn across and the screws removed. There was a minute's pause, and the upper part of the lid was lifted. What a relief to all our apprehensions! There lay the venerable priest absolutely unchanged. The biretta had fallen slightly forward, owing most likely to the water and the moving of the coffin, and rested on the bridge of the strongly marked aquiline nose. One of the spectators lifted the biretta and exposed the forehead. On this there were a few black spots, which at first seemed to be evidence of the decomposition, but a closer examination showed that they were simply little bits of the silk with which the biretta was lying. And so these honoured remains repose in the sarcophagus in the crypt of St. Michael's Mortuary Chapel, to be seen no more by those who witnessed the sights here related, but perhaps to be seen and acknowledged as the relics of a saint in the future. R.I.P. We, the undersigned, who were present and witnessed the various facts related in the foregoing statement, hereby certify that the said statement is true in every particular. William Marnie, James Landau, Sister Mary St. Germain, Sister Marie St. Benoit, Sister Marie of the Holy Sacrament, Lowther Broad, William Miller Sr., George Miller Jr., Timothy O'Connell, John A. McCartney. Dated at Nelson, the 2nd day, February 1891. So the remains of Father Garin now reside on a plinth in the crypt beneath St. Michael's Mortuary Chapel, and some subsequent parish priests are buried either side of him. At the moment, the chapel's an earthquake risk and is closed to the public. Naming it St. Michael's Chapel may be a nod to the name of Garin's boarding school, but in the Catholic tradition, Michael the Archangel, who is St. Michael, as well as battling Satan, which he's shown there in that statue doing, he was also charged with weighing the souls of the dead to determine who was worthy of heaven. So it's a very appropriate name for a chapel. The incorruption of the body has been taken by many people as a sign of the holiness of Antoine Garin.